Let's just start out with an easy question. How long have you been with the Winona Police Department and how long have you been chief?
Okay, so I've been with the Winona Police Department for 38 years. So this was my first and only job, born, raised, school, employed, all in the city of Winona. I took over as chief approximately 5 years ago when Chief Bostrak retired, right in the midst of COVID for the most part. We were down 9 officers at that point in time, or close, starting to go on the downward trend of 9 people leaving, and I just didn't, I was actually scheduled for retirement, and I didn't feel it was the right time because I didn't want to make us 10 down, and given the entire flux of the world at that point in time, I just decided to stay on and fulfill actually a lifelong goal of mine was to be a chief of police somewhere, and ultimately I wanted it to be Winona. It initially didn't work out, but you know, as they say, things do have a strange way of working out. So that's how I ended up here today.
So 38 years in the department, born and raised in Winona. Have you ever worked on a case like the Kingsbury and Fravel case and the department as a whole? Has it ever been such a big undertaking like this?
This has been the undertaking that I don't wish on anyone in law enforcement. Historically, for the City of Winona Police Department, no. We have not encountered a case of this magnitude, this duration, this level of investigation in I'm sure the entire time that the department has been in existence, for that matter. These are investigations, as I mentioned, I don't wish on anyone, and obviously with the caveat on that is I don't wish that on any family whatsoever. So yeah, I think there was a lot of learning that went on during the point in time, but again, I go back to the point that we had so many people that just reached out, citizens, law enforcement, other family members, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, working so tightly with the Fillmore County Sheriff's Office and the BCA. I mean, every agency, the Buffalo County Sheriff's Department, they all said, what do you need? And they showed up for us. And they provided expertise and manpower when we needed it.
And I'm sure vice versa, if any other county or agency was in a situation like this, the Winona Police Department would be right there.
Oh, we
for
would
them.
step in immediately with no questions asked. The level of cooperation that we received is unparalleled.
So let's go back to March 31st of 2023, April 1st, 2023, those first few hours. When did you personally get concerned as the police chief?
So I obviously remember it very vividly. I was not involved on the Friday evening call, when again, I have to praise Katie Kolka 1,000%. She sensed something was wrong and she acted. She knew in her heart that things were not right, and she wasn't going to just let it go. She went out to the residents. She noticed the van in the driveway. She noticed no lights on. Adam's car was gone. Maddie had not been responding to text messages, phone calls, nothing. And she immediately knew something was wrong and she called in the welfare check. Our responding officers were able to get a hold of the landlord. They were able to key into the residence after obviously looking in windows, knocking on windows, pounding on the doors, talking to the neighbor, have you seen Maddie? And of course the response was no. They were able to go into the apartment, walk through it, didn't see anything obvious, and obviously nobody was home. So they left, attempted to call Adam. Ultimately, we're able to speak with Adam a little bit later in the evening. Officer Ethan Sense actually talked to him initially. Adam had said that he was down at his parents' residence with both of the children and that he had no idea where Maddie was. That they had kind of were in the process of going their separate ways. So from those initial officers doing what they needed to do, I think that was important. And then what happened the following morning was that our new shift that started was briefed on what took place, and Sergeant Brad Barrientos was like, this is not right. There is something wrong. And he contacted Deputy Chief Jay Rasmussen, the other sergeant in the investigative unit, and said, we've got a missing person, we need to act on this. They immediately started the process, pinging her phone, doing all the electronic things that we possibly could to try and determine where she was and set that initial timeline up. Within a couple hours, Maddie's family, David and Megan, had contacted us. They actually got down here, I believe it was relatively early. My memory serves me right, around 9-10 in the morning. They filled out a missing persons report. Deputy Chief Rasmussen called me at home. He said, just want to give you the heads up. He said, I think something's wrong here, and kind of gave me the brief. I said, well, give me a call back if you hear anything. By noon, I hadn't heard anything, so I came in. At that stage, we had kind of done the preliminary aspects. We had decided what we needed to do as next steps. A couple of our investigators were going to go down to Mabel and speak to Adam at his parents' residence. We contacted the BCA and said, this is something terribly wrong here. We need to jump on this immediately. So we had already notified the BCA. Later in the day, I had actually met with the family, with the Kingsbury family. They obviously were extremely concerned. They knew that there was something very wrong. This was not Maddie. So that's kind of how the whole thing started out, and kind of where we got from Friday evening to Saturday into Sunday.
Which leads me into my next question. From the start, the police department, started a missing persons report, which, isn't really common to get a missing persons report filed that quickly. I believe it's usually 48 hours, I think, is the generic timeline on that.
Well, I think there's probably a great misconception on missing persons in general, just saying, well, law enforcement won't take a missing persons report for 48 hours or something to that effect. And that's simply not the case. They're obviously looked at, every single case is looked at as its merits. And if it's somebody who has basically a history of, I typically check with him, once a month, or I haven't talked to him in 6 months, or that type of thing. Those are all things of consideration that you kind of look at and say, what's their employment history? What's this type of thing? Is this kind of normal, if you will, for that individual? And for Maddie, it was not. It was not normal at all. So that's why I think it kind of precipitated this immediacy of, she has 2 small children. She drops the kids off at daycare. She picks the kids up from daycare. And then it was like 8:15, 8:20 in the morning after dropping the children off at daycare with Adam. That's it. There is no further contact.
And, I mean, to the credit of her loved ones, her friends, her family, they were sounding the alarm. This is not right. This is not Madeline, and your department was very receptive to that, to your credit. And that is why the investigation started off so quickly.
Yes. And again, I go back to those initial responding officers and to the sergeant that follow up the next day. He knew in his experience, in his personal life, with his family, and what is considered to be normal and not normal. And we trust the fact, obviously, that Maddie's family knows her the best and said, this is not right.
At what point did the investigation, because immediately everybody in the department knew this is not right. The BCA got involved very quickly. And at what point did the investigation shift from a missing person to this may be a murder investigation?
I think when it really kind of started going down that path is when we were continually trying to ping her phone. The location showed that it was within basically several hundred feet of her residence. Checked with her employer, and they said she logged on the computer and then it basically logged off. The fact that her car was there and it was backed into the driveway, and again, talking to friends, they described Maddie as not the best driver, and she typically would never back in. She would always pull into the driveway, just a nuance. But what really, I think, kind of swayed the investigation was when we made application for a search warrant to get into the apartment. And when we walked in the door, we found her jacket that she had been wearing that morning directly inside the door. And within that jacket pocket was her cell phone. Her shoes were in the kitchen. Her briefcase and laptops were set directly inside the door. Again, her plan, according to work and friends, was she was going to head to Rochester for work. That never happened. So it was like she came in at 8:20, because we can document that via video footage, and then she never left. At least never walked out on her own. So I think that's when it really started going, okay, her phone's here, her coat's here, her shoes are here, her briefcase is here, her laptop's here, and she's not. So what happened? So I think that's probably where we really, really went. This is getting to be, she was taken by someone, because we have no footage of her walking out of the residence or another vehicle or anybody else pulling up and picking her up and taking her.
And adding on to that, I mean, no mother is just going to leave their children at daycare like that.
Absolutely not. I mean, our investigation and her friends and family are like, her children basically were her world. She did everything for them. And you don't drop your children off at 8 o'clock in the morning and then never make contact with your daycare provider at all, or with your family. And there were plans for her to take one of the children to the cities the following day. Never materialized, never called and said plans have changed. So that's obviously one of the things that we, again, looked at and the family members kept saying is no. And, being a dad, and obviously the other members of the department around here is like, you don't do that.
Now, throughout the investigation, your team was uncovering evidence of domestic abuse. And that can take a toll on the department. It can take a toll on her family, on her friends. As a journalist covering the story, it took a toll on me. How important were Madeline's loved ones that knew a past history of things that had happened so important in that process?
It's huge because it provides a lot of background that as law enforcement we don't have, right? So talking to David and talking to Megan and talking to Katie, getting that history of where was the relationship? How did Adam and Maddie meet? Obviously, we look at police records. Did they call the police every week? Absolutely not. Was there documented calls for police service to that address? Absolutely not. Does that mean that there was not domestic abuse taking place in the residence? Absolutely not. Sometimes things stay behind closed doors. One thing that we do know when it comes to domestic abuse is the most dangerous time when leaving a relationship is when it's finalized and you're out the door. We know based on the history of where Maddie had gone and made application for housing, that she had signed a lease, that there was discussion between the two of them about the potential of daycare and where's that daycare going to be located. Adam living at his parents' residence in Mabel, Maddie staying here in Winona area. There is a distance. Maddie was going to continue to take care of the children, but then where was daycare going to be? Is it going to be in Rushford so that it's more convenient for both of them or not? Maddie did start seeing somebody other than Adam afterwards. And ultimately, the other thing that I think that probably needs to be taken note of is the fact that Adam made reference to, I'm losing the name here.
Gabby Petito.
Gabby Petito, the Gabby Petito story. And we started looking at that and going, there were references by Adam prior about the Gabby Petito case and the fact that he watched the video and he had done things, and you're going to end up just like Gabby Petito. So those things were like striking, kind of curious points of that is unusual to say the least. So those different types of things, other family members, friends stating, we witnessed the fact where, she was on a FaceTime call with somebody and she was holding one of the children and he came up and hit her. The text messages that he had sent to her, putting your hands on me in front of the children is not okay. You'll learn. Again, physical, financial. He hadn't worked for years. Maddie was the supporting person. Adam was losing that by her moving out of the house, by her having a new boyfriend, him having to go and live at home. I mean, these are all things where he's slowly losing control and things are slipping away from him. So I think it had actually, Maddie had left in the past and she came back. But I think that it had gotten to that final point in time where she was done. She was moving out. She was going to go to another apartment. She was going to take the children. She had a new person that she was seeing, and it wasn't Adam, and he was going to have to go live with his parents.
Which leads me into my next question. The guilty verdict, which we will get into in a little bit later in this interview, in a way was a somber win for victims and survivors. As someone in law enforcement, anything that you want victims or survivors or anyone just who is not sure of the relationship they're in right now, anything that you want them to know?
There is always so many avenues for help, but the biggest thing that is so difficult is for victims to make that ultimate step, to leave the relationship. Typically, financially, emotionally, it's the other direction, where the husband, the boyfriend, is the financial person that's providing the greatest income. They're the ones that are in control. Everything is in their name. So when the other person wants to leave, they don't feel like they can make that separation because they are so dependent on the individual, and they're willing to endure the verbal abuse, the physical abuse, the mental abuse. But there are so many avenues and so many people out there that are willing to help. And when you are getting to that point in time where you feel that it is time to make that break, reach out to them and have them available to you. Have family members. Don't go it alone. Make sure that you have somebody there to assist you with it.
Mm-hmm. And as the Winona Police Department, what resources do you have for domestic violence victims?
So I would say that our biggest advocate is probably our advocacy center located here in Winona. They provide services for everything. If you're in an abusive relationship and law enforcement gets called, and again, it doesn't have to be a referral from law enforcement. The agencies are available to take people, phone calls, walk-ins, whatever it happens to be, to assist them. We always make referrals on domestic calls to the advocacy center. An advocate will call the individual. We give them the phone number, however they want it to work out, to have them reach out. We have an investigator that will follow up with the victim the following day because, again, there's that 12 to 24-hour cooling off period where it's like, oh no, he made a mistake, I'm going to do this, whatever. And they try and walk through it so that the emotions aren't necessarily there. The Advocacy Center assists with filling out harassment restraining orders, domestic abuse no contact orders, walks them through the system because it can be daunting, right? You've been in a relationship, you depend on this person, now you're encountering something that it appears to be insurmountable. all the paperwork, entering the judicial system, trying to go to court, going in front of a judge. These are all terrifying in and of themselves. So they are there for you. They're supportive of you. They give you alternatives for housing and employment and that type of thing. It goes on and on. But most of all, it's that emotional and mental support that you're doing the right thing.
And it never is just a mistake by someone. You know, everything that I've heard, you know, as I've gotten into covering a lot about domestic abuse, while covering the story, is I've heard that, you know, if someone's capable of doing it once, they can do it again.
Yes, typically the behavior doesn't go backwards, it increases, it escalates. What may start out as, you know, just something small when you're dating, of all of a sudden, where have you been? Who are you with? Let me see your phone. Give me the password to your phone. I want all the passwords to your social media accounts to see who you've been talking to. Those should kind of be key indicators of, okay, we're getting into too much of a controlling relationship here. There's got to be a very big sense of trust between us for this to take place. And if you start controlling who I see, where I go, who I'm talking to, what my discussions are about, that should be an initial red flag to, okay, maybe this is something that we either need to discuss and come to an agreement, or maybe we need to go our separate ways.
Now, shifting back a little bit more towards the investigation, June 7th, the day that she was found by investigator Dan Dorning for the Fillmore County Sheriff's Office, what was going through your mind when you get the call that she was found and then Adam Frable had been arrested?
So obviously after such a period of time, I mean, again, you always look and say, we're going to find her, you know, in 48 hours, we're going to find her in 72 hours, we're going to find her in a week. And obviously as every day ticked by and as the investigation continued and continued and continued, and the electronic information, which was, to describe it, I can't even describe the amount of information that was coming in. The amount of video footage that we were trying to find, we were trying to establish that timeline, and then the returns and the text messages and the emails with the number of different accounts that were going on, you know, with Maddie's account and Adam's account, and our team of investigators trying to deal with that. But then the BCA was also helping us. But again, the aspect of having the actual investigation in-house, you have that intimate knowledge of the investigation that maybe somebody in another agency or another location doesn't necessarily know and doesn't have all the backgrounds as it relates to it. So I look at those initial days of all the searching that went on, and basically they were somewhat targeted, but we had no idea. Was it water? Was it bluffs? Was it farm fields? Was it roadsides? We had no idea where we were looking. And if you look at the acreage that surrounds Winona and Fillmore and Mabel, it's incredible. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of acres. And we had nowhere to start. We had the house was the last place. And we had Adam's story of, this is what I did throughout the day. So obviously you try and corroborate his story and build that timeline. So as we did all these searches and we were continually coming up empty, 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 empty. Where do we look? Where do we look? Trying to pinpoint his travels throughout the day, taking his limited statements apart piece by piece and saying, what did he say? Where did he go? And try and pick out these landmarks, and then try and do a timeline where we last have the van on video and then where it comes back. How much area could be traveled in that period of time? And when you start, you think, oh, we can narrow that down. Ridiculous. It's county road, dirt road, minimum maintenance road, farm field approach. So it got very daunting. And again, I think it went through everybody's mind of, are we ever going to find her? And you always stay positive, right? So you have a picture of the Maddie and the two children on your computer every day to remind you that this is what we're doing it for. We stayed in contact with David. Basically, he was the point of contact, if you will, for the family. We were going through all the evidence and tried to keep him updated, obviously keep it positive. We had citizens that were going out on their own and taking care of it, which I think was evidenced in that first weekend with the search parties that were organized. But as it started narrowing down a little bit more, and I have to tip my hat to investigator Angie Evans. She is meticulous when it comes to digital forensic examinations. And she had that knowledge of the case. And when she was going through the returns and she saw emails where there was an invoice to an owner of property by the Fravels that we had spoken to earlier, and it said for mowing at this location. Well, that was a location that we were aware of, but we hadn't really focused on it. So we had reached out to one of the sheriff's deputies who is familiar with the individual that owns the property and said, hey, do you know where this property is located? And he said, yeah, it's located just outside of Choice. Well, coincidentally enough, that is the exact same phrase that Adam used in his interview. He goes, I turned around just outside of Choice. So we asked Dan Dornick from the Fillmore County Sheriff's Office, are you familiar with this property? And he said, yes. He goes, we drove down that road a couple times during the initial search. And we drove down and got to the gate and drove back. We didn't really see anything. And we said, well, Angie found something on the computer return, and we think that we should probably do our next huge law enforcement only focus search on that location. We had done about an 80-acre field behind, adjoining to the Fravel property with law enforcement only. I don't know, we did 70 or 80 law enforcement officials only, and we just basically went, arm length away and went through the field entire day to do that, and again came up empty. So that was going to be our next focus. We were planning on doing that, I believe it was on the following Monday. We were starting to organize the number of law enforcement officers that we could get to do that. Dan said, I'm very aware of the location. He goes, I'll take a run down there. I'll take a look and see what the property looks like. I'll take a look and see what the underbrush is like, what the growth was starting out. Obviously, at that point in time, it's going to be tough sledding to get through there, what the deal is. And we get a phone call a couple hours after he said he was heading there. You could tell in his voice that something huge had been discovered by him. He had reached out to our special agent from the BCA who was in Rochester, who had been running point for the BCA, told him what he had observed, Joe Swenson, and Joe said, I will be there as soon as I possibly can. I'm leaving now. We waited here at the law enforcement center for confirmation, and Joe called us and he said, it's Maddie. So he notified the crime lab from the Twin Cities, and we all headed out there. And we had pretty much decided when we found Maddie that we would place Adam under arrest. So a group of us went to Maddie's location, and another group went to the Fravel residence in Mabel and arrested him without incident at the residence. And again, the BCA crime lab meticulously uncovered where Maddie was hidden, and we brought her out and placed her in the vehicle. The medical examiner was there as well. We could, at that point in time, without the ME saying it, but based on the tattoos that were prevalent, we were very confident that it was Maddie's remains.
Makes your heart drop.
It does.
Because, like you said, you have the photo up every single day, and you're reminding yourself while you're doing this, and you're hoping and praying that this mother's going to come home to her two children, and then in a phone call, that all changes. And then that starts the next part of the investigation.
100%. And again, as you say, you always hope that you're going to have that anomaly, that she went somewhere with someone and we missed it. But as every day went by and there was no activity on financials, no activity on social media, and she would to not reach out to her children and her family, you just knew. You hoped for the best, but knew the worst was coming. When that day actually hit, or when that actually hit everybody around here, it may have been different for everybody. But I think it ultimately was, we're not going to find her alive. Now our biggest mission is just to bring her home to her family. And again, David and his family had left Winona, had gone back home. I guess, we had to have BCA agents go and make the notification. I wish, I could have done it, but it just wasn't feasible, not with social media the way it is. We needed to have that personal notification versus somebody saying, hey, David. So we tried to coordinate that as much as we could, as best as we could, to let Megan know that we were fairly confident that it took place. And as you say, then the whole thing shifted, right? So it went from this to now we have to prepare for trial.
Mm-hmm. That leads me into my next question. This was a massive trial, month long, moved out of the county. So there's another layer of that. And talk about preparing your team for trial and how nerve-wracking that is.
Well, I think one of the big takeaways, or one of the other things that needs to be addressed, is the fact that our county attorney, Karen Sonneman, from the get-go, realized that this was going to be a pretty horrendous case. I mean, very, very involved. Her office was severely short-staffed, just as we were severely short-staffed. I think we were down 9 officers during this investigation. And Karen made the decision to reach out to another attorney that had greater experience, because at that time it was a no-body case ultimately. So she made the decision to bring on Phil Prokopowicz. Phil is retired, and Karen approached him, described the case to him. He had experience with prosecution of cases, no-body cases. He was successful, and she reached out and asked him if he'd be willing to be a special prosecutor for the county attorney's office, and he graciously accepted, again, based on the case, on the fact that it's Maddie, there's 2 small children involved, that the relationship is there. He's like, I'm going to do this for Madeline. So having his expertise was huge. Mm-hmm. From the get-go, he was like, data. We have to get all the data. We have to put it in a central repository. We have to make sure that discovery is done. Again, he has the expertise in the case. We have done very large cases in the past, but again, nothing to this magnitude. So when Phil stepped in, it was that sense of, perfect, we've got experience, we have knowledge that's going to guide this. He is the single point of contact for this. This was his one and only focus. And so we were able, on the front end, even before Madeline's body was found and Adam was taken into custody, he was instrumental in assisting, help kind of provide suggestions on things to do in this type of an investigation. And we really took those to heart. Once we were able to get ready for trial, we had all the data. It was getting all that discovery out to the defense attorney, and it kind of took off from there. He's aware of obviously moving trials to different jurisdictions. We had looked, I think that they had come up with 3 different locations that they were trying to decide for us. Obviously the Blue Earth in Mankato was one. I think St. Cloud was another one. which would not have been, that would have been worse. 3 some hours through the metro area would have been even more difficult. But yeah, it adds a whole nother layer, not only for us, but for our sheriff's office, because our sheriff's office was responsible for courtroom security and security of the prisoner going to and from court and that type of thing. Once he was in the Blue Earth County Jail, it was their responsibility. But then facilitating and moving from the courtroom and everything, in court security, that was all handled by our sheriff's office. But again, we had to line up, a block of 10 hotel rooms, trying to figure out scheduling for the officers, know that it's a 2.5 hour drive at least to get there, 2.5 hours back. It gets to be a logistical nightmare, to be honest with you, because of course, as you were very well aware, there were a lot of delays throughout the case, right? Mm-hmm. So we had planned on starting testimony potentially Wednesday or Thursday of that first week. Well, that was all taken with jury selection. So now that shoves the calendar all the way down. So we had to deal with that as well. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, is it worth it for that? Would I have preferred to have it right next door? Absolutely. I think we all would have. But in order to give Adam the best venue for his defense and potential jurors, that again, kudos to the court for making that decision. It gives the defendant the best option for a fair and impartial jury.
The verdict. It was exactly 1 month after, and I remember sitting in the media room, that morning, November 7th, and I was just like, okay, this could be coming down any second now, and I know that law enforcement was in town the night before, waiting for that verdict. Tell me, were you nervous that it could come back not guilty?
I guess my personal feelings were he was going to be guilty. I mean, ultimately, he was going to be guilty. It's just, what was the jury going to find him guilty of? I felt extremely confident in the work that was put into the case. I felt extremely confident in Phil and Christina Gillespie's presentation of the case to the jury. I was very confident in Phil's closing and his rebuttal. Not to knock Zach Bauer, I think Zach Bauer did a phenomenal job in a defense for Adam. But ultimately, I think that the jury obviously saw the evidence, saw the timeline, and ultimately came to the absolute most correct decision. And I respect them for doing that. Ultimately, I look back and I thought that maybe I assumed incorrectly that the jury would be out for a shorter period of time, that they probably would have gotten a verdict that first day, and then when it went into a second day, I started wondering, okay, again, as everybody does, I wonder what they're questioning, I wonder what they want more information on. But then shortly after, obviously, that morning, they came back with a verdict and guilty on all counts. I don't know if you can really pick an emotion to help you describe what I think each person individually felt. I think it's relief might be a word. You never use happy, right? You have two families that are completely torn apart. The Fravels who have lost their son to prison, not seeing their grandchildren for who knows how long. And the Kingsburys, who are going to have to deal with the loss of their daughter forever. So, is there a winner? No. Is there vindication for law enforcement to say, we believe this is what happened, we presented the facts, Phil presented the facts to the jury, and the jury agreed with us. So that's what this system is based on, and in this instance, I definitely feel it worked. And then furthermore, how do you move on from here? So we still have contact with David. He sends us pictures of the children and making snowmen. And, that kind of warms your heart.
Yeah. And like you said, two families are torn apart in this situation, and it's hard for both families. And because of his decision, so many people's lives had been changed, and not for the better.
Yes. And it's a spur of the moment, I would assume. I mean, it's a history of abuse, right? You get to that point in time, and you can go one way or you can go the other way. You can decide to separate, you can work through it, you can do child custody, and you move on, separate, but you move on. Or you can choose the other avenue, which, again, has totally destroyed two families.
So he was sentenced to life in prison. He's currently in St. Cloud, and he's never going to get out. He's never going to harm anyone else. But now there's an appeal filed. Are you surprised that there is an appeal filed?
No, it's automatic in the state of Minnesota, so I'm not surprised. Again, it's the appellate court taking a look to see if the lower courts erred during the process. From my perspective, again, my opinion and my opinion only, I think that Judge Beitendorf was very fair in her rulings. I think that she was probably correct in her rulings. I'm not sure who's going to. I believe that an attorney from the State Public Defender's Office is going to handle Adam's case because Zach is not going to handle it. Phil will continue on to handle the appeal process and the arguments for Winona County. And again, I feel extremely confident in his abilities to do this. Again, not having the ins and outs of trial law as they do and the judges. I respect the decision. It's part of the process. That's what this whole thing is built on. And absolutely, he's entitled to appeal. He should get an appeal. And, we'll argue. And if there were errors made, that will be decided by the appellate judges.
And so Madeline's story has reached far and wide, not just in southeastern Minnesota, but I've heard stories of people all the way in Canada, all the way across the country that have heard Madeline's story. Tell us about the direct impact that it's had on the department. Is there anything, I guess, a different way that the department approaches something?
I think probably we were kind of going, and it's kind of ironic that you mentioned that aspect because obviously as a small town chief of police, you deal with for the most part, probably 7-county area. You typically don't have cases that are going to reach outside of that, except maybe you get the Twin Cities on an occasional story that takes place. But within probably 5 days, I was getting calls from California news outlets and New York news outlets. And they actually started a podcast following this case from two retired NYPD homicide investigators that was running on this. Again, another shout out to the BCA for bringing in their public information officer to assist. I was inundated with media requests, and I just kept funneling them to Bonnie. I'm like, Bonnie, can you do this? And phenomenal, took that off my plate. We would go over press releases and that type of thing to make sure that, these are fine, these are good, you're not releasing too much information, you're giving enough information. She was a media anchor for her own times earlier. And so she was aware of what the media would want and what they would expect, and what you absolutely can't do when it came to the media. So I think that gave us a new appreciation and better understanding of what the media is. We were contacted by 48 hours within 3 days, I think, of the case.
Wow.
Wanting to, again, get boots on the ground right away and follow the story from beginning to end. Ultimately, the decision was no on that based on family preferences and the county attorney's office as well. So from our standpoint, we look at it from the media. I've always looked at the media as an ally, that we need to utilize the media as much as possible, that we need to provide information to them and utilize them. If it's print, if it's television, if it's radio, if it's social media, we need to capitalize on that and make sure that everybody's getting the same information at the same time, so that they can all give accurate reporting. So I've always had that position for my entire time with the police department here in Winona when I was deputy chief and also as chief. So I think it's important, and I think it's something that we kind of look at from an administrative standpoint, that that's what we do with our media. We're always as much of an open book as we can possibly be. The other point that we had kind of started going department-wide was more of an in-house digital forensic examination capability, i.e. cell phones and computers. So there's a couple of major players when it comes to that. Is if we get a telephone or a computer, are we able in-house to prioritize our electronic devices, extract the data from those, create reports, and then read those reports? We were at a point in time where everything we had to go out. So it either went to Olmsted County, who was very gracious in handling our information. However, they would extract it, but then we'd get the whole reports back and we'd have to analyze that. Now we have the ability of extracting and analyzing in-house and doing that ourselves. So it went to either Olmsted County, went to the BCA, it went to the MOCIC. So you can understand, if these agencies are all getting phones from us, that multiply that how many different times by how many different agencies that are utilizing them. So we are up and running. And again, Angie Evans and Sergeant Adam Bromrick have really taken the forefront on that. We're doing, for the most part, everything in-house. So we're able to do our own phones from inception in the field to preparation for court.
Mm-hmm. And that was kind of started because of this massive undertaking of this case.
100%. And again, BCA, they were here. They came down. They were sitting at this table. We were bringing them phones. They were extracting it at that point in time, or they would, Joe Swenson or another agent would take it up to the BCA, and because of how high of a priority this case was, they would do the evidence piece of it and they'd ship it back to us. So that kind of, I guess, really started to push us to get into that, more into that. We were dabbling, right? We were just kind of investigating cost, training, and that type of thing. But ultimately, we've got an investigator that can do Gray Key, which handles certain kind of phones, and somebody else can do Cellbrate. So we can basically do every phone that's on the market and extract those. Again, there's computer updates, obviously, as new phones come out. There's a delay in being able to access those phones, but we have the capabilities in-house. So it just basically accelerated us getting there.
Yeah. That's all my questions. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, I think, again, I can't stress enough probably the community, how they rallied. And I say community in terms of citizens as well as law enforcement community and first responders. We had volunteer fire departments and horses and drones and aircraft, and it was to try and wrap my head around all the things. And Ben Klinger, our emergency management director from Winona County, he received the Emergency Management Director of the Year award, and rightfully so. He's another one that stepped up and said, Tom, I will organize the posses. I will organize the search efforts. That first weekend when we had 1,200 people, that's Ben. I was up to my eyeballs trying to figure out, where are we going in the criminal investigation of it? But we had all these citizens that wanted to help. This is somebody's daughter. They could internalize that. They could so feel that. And they felt the need to go out and do something. And they were going to do it with or without law enforcement's assistance. Well, obviously, if there's 1,200 people out there, we want to at least give them some direction of what to look for, have a point of contact and that type of thing to kind of go that route. So I can't say enough about the assistance that we receive from everybody, far and wide. It didn't matter borders, people came. And they participated and they helped and they rallied around us. They didn't attack us and say we weren't doing what we needed to be doing. And, you know, the Kingsbury family, it may come from David's background of being an attorney and military background, but again, and Stephen is currently in the military. He understood the aspect of the criminal investigation. He was the person we would go to try and give the message to the rest. They let us do our job. They understood there were things that we couldn't tell, and really appreciated the things that we could. So they were extremely supportive of us, and they knew that we were doing everything in our power to bring Madeline home. And to be able to do that for them is huge. You know, I often think, what if, right? What if we wouldn't have found her? Would we have gotten to trial? Could I have retired peacefully, knowing that she hadn't been recovered when it was my ultimate responsibility to do it as being the chief law enforcement officer of the agency? So ultimately I can retire with the ability of saying, yes, that was done. And it is the supporting cast, right? You look good because you surround yourself with good people. I get the best.
Plans for retirement?
$1 million question, right? I 38 years, people tell me I'm absolutely nuts, but my response to the people that are like, what? Is that I still like my job. I come to work every day because I enjoy it. And I obviously have a deep vested interest in this community. I never left. And I don't know that I'll leave afterwards. But I have a great supporting role, a great supporting cast that truly deserves to aspire to what I wanted, to become a chief, to become a deputy chief, to get promoted to sergeant, to experience the things that I have in 38 years. They deserve that opportunity as well. I just need to come to peace with it myself and feel that I've accomplished the things that I wanted to accomplish and be able to make that transition from what has been my life for 38 years into that next piece. So it may be sooner, it may be later, I don't know.